I think like when I first got involved with ethics and safety, I felt a little discouraged. And actually, in between, I was like, okay, I'm not going to work on ethics anymore. I'm going to go do consulting or I'm going to do some like other corporate nonsense. But I would say that like honestly, when we win, it's extremely gratifying. This feeling of like winning for the greater good is something that you can't replace.
What does tech ethics mean to you exactly?
To me, I think ethics is about basically putting people over profit.
The following is a conversation with Vinaya Sivakumar. Currently pursuing tech ethics at UC Berkeley, she's successfully lobbied for AI safety legislation in addition to doing research on the subject. Get ready for a mind-bending episode.
Hello, so today I'd like to welcome Vinaya to the podcast. She is actually an expert in tech ethics, which I actually haven't had on the podcast for a while, so I'm excited to get into this. I guess my first question for you is, what brought you into tech ethics in specific? It's like a very niche field. What kind of got you into it?
Yeah, so I think that I kind of got into this like ethics space primarily from my own experiences using technology. So I kind of was one of the first quote unquote adopters on social media. I
Yeah.
got it when I was in like third grade, but I got like really into it when I was in middle school and around seventh grade. And there's like a lot of not so great things about social media, and that like I started to depend my self-esteem and like correlate that to how many likes I got. And even to this day, like I'm not fully over these things, right? Like I
Yeah.
want to know how many likes I get and how many comments I get. And so these things are, intentionally done by tech companies. And so it's like by design, they want you to feel a certain way. And so then I started, getting very involved in advocacy because I didn't want these things to exist anymore because I saw the effect that it had on me. I saw the effect that it was having on my peers. And so I worked a lot in like lobbying. I worked a lot in grassroots advocacy and some research and really try to understand, what are these harms? And back then, this was around like 2019, there wasn't that much research done on this. So, what are these harms and how can we prevent it? And a lot of that was at that time, persuading tech companies that like this is a problem. Because back then they maybe have did research about all of this, but it wasn't as public as maybe it is today. So yeah, like think about like pre Frances Haugen time. Like that's how
Yeah.
long ago this was. So it was definitely a struggle, but it's been extremely gratifying because we've had a lot of big wins. But we can talk about that, later in the podcast as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I definitely think it's much more of a public issue now. Like after like all these documentaries have been released, like the sh social network and stuff like that, of like what actually goes behind these tech companies. Yeah, but it's interesting to hear like what brought you in. I'm curious, what does tech ethics mean to you exactly? Like, I know it can be interpreted in a lot of ways, but what does using tech ethics in tech products even mean?
Yeah, so this is definitely uh, up to interpretation. I think a
Yeah.
lot of different people have a lot of different definitions. To me, I think ethics is about basically putting people over profit. And like that can look like in a lot of different ways. And, for example, content moderation, right? Like that's something that I would consider to be ethical because there's a lot of content out there that's harmful, that is just very hateful towards different communities. But, establishing these content moderators on these different platforms means that the company needs to put up a certain amount of money to have it. So it to me it means that maybe it's not the best business decision you're making, but it's one that you're really centering people in the heart of that decision. So I think that like very commonly ethics is more focused on discriminatory practices on products like social media. For example, like algorithmic bias is a big one where like the models on the algorithms on the social media platforms may prefer like one race or one gender over another. So how do we first a find out that happens, and b like how do we put some mitigation, or measures in place? So yeah, I think that's kind of what it is in a very short form. There's very like complex definitions that I'm sure someone else could give you, but I think like from my perspective, that's what it is.
So you mentioned working with research in this space. I'm curious what your research was about.
Yeah, so I think my most recent research project is on generative biases in large language models. So essentially, we're looking at different profiles of people across different diversities based on ethnicity, based on gender representation, or affiliations, and seeing how different LLMs will output different images or just react to you naturally. So this is kind of going back to what I was previously talking about, algorithmic biases and discriminatory algorithms. So trying to see like, is there a difference? And I think this is pretty important because I was like recently using ChatGPT to help me summarize a article that I thought was really interesting, but it was like incredibly long. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna need some help here.
Mhm.
And the author was um, a man, but it like randomly changed the pronouns to she, her just based on the name alone. So I think it's very interesting to think about like, why is the model making these decisions? What kind of data is it being trained on? So I guess like ethics is kind of more looking at that data set and seeing like what exactly is going wrong. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it for sure all stems from like the human biases and just gets magnified from there. So that's why it's interesting because this also does happen in real life, obviously. Like real people do make these like decisions based on biases. But when like AI does it, it's kind of, well, it's a bit of a bigger issue. Yeah, I guess I'm wondering like how, like other than looking at training data and stuff like that, how can we solve issues with tech ethics?
I think the biggest way to solve it is probably through looking at the data, just because it gives us a good representation of like what it gives us. It gives us a good foundation to understanding why the model is outputting what it does. For
Mhm.
example, like GPT-2, we know that it was trained on Reddit data. So we have a good understanding of what kind of outputs it's going to have, right? Like
Yeah.
Reddit has a certain
Yeah.
vibe, right? Like of what it is.
Yeah.
So maybe you can see naturally understand, like, okay, it's probably going to be discriminatory to XYZ communities and more in favor of XYZ communities. So I think that like understanding the data that goes into it, which is a huge task because these models are trained on such incredibly large data sets. I think that's the biggest challenge we have to face. Um, but also, I think that a big part of ethics is that, like, in a very capitalistic market like the US, I think that's also about having very ethical business decisions. One of the projects that I worked on in high school was about Instagram for kids. And now we have that. They unfortunately, launched it. But back then, they tried to launch it and we stopped it because we were like, we don't want minors to be on this platform. And I think that a lot of that came from people like me who are like, we witnessed these harms
Mhm.
and we at this grown age who didn't know how to handle it. And so how will minors who don't know anything about anything be able to respond to different harms on the platform?
Mhm.
And so, obviously for Instagram, and this has been said in many different reports, that children are a very profitable thing for them. Like it's very easy to get young kids addicted to their platforms. So for them, introducing this is a great business strategy. But what does that mean in terms of the person itself, right? So I think that's also this kind of like problem we're facing. And I think that legislators are becoming increasingly good at this and that they are meeting with industry experts and they want to make change and that they're like always trying to, put out these bills. I think some of it is a little performative. Actually, maybe don't say that I said that, but maybe just for you. Like, I think it's a little performative. Um, how do I word this? I think that like our biggest challenge here is that we have like these lobbyists that are creating like millions and millions of dollars worth of PACs that like elect tech friendly candidates. So I think there has to be a point at which businesses are like, okay, we've made enough money. Now we need to start putting people at the center of it. But I think those are just like the two biggest challenges of like where do we identify the harms, where they come from, and also, how do we once we identify these harms, how do we actually mitigate it in regulation or other systemic changes?
I mean, so what are some examples of regulation or policies? I know there was one in California recently, but like, what are some of your favorite examples of successfully implementing this?
Yeah. So I guess I have two answers. The first is the age appropriate design code. And that is more social media focused. It's about how social media companies should basically think about minors when they are designing their platforms. And one of the clauses of this bill is that like if you are a minor and like you say this, that like maybe your profile is set to default private, because that way that you don't have like these random creepy people, you know, looking at
Yeah.
your social media profile. So it's like that default settings is a big part of it. That was a short-lived victory because we were able to get it passed, but now it's still after like 3 4 years still held up in the Ninth Circuit on grounds of like First Amendment violations. So it's my favorite bill that I've worked on, and we've like successfully passed it in other states. But in California, you know, that was the very first bill that I worked on. Kids Online Safety Act, you know, that's also a big one in the social media space, which failed the first time, but is looking forward to being passed, I believe. And then today we had a big victory.
Mhm.
Hopefully it stays. It's not a short-lived victory, but SB 53, which is a bill that basically tries to hold AI companies or frontier model labs accountable for their like advanced AI systems. And I think the cool thing is that like, well, I think it's cool. Maybe tech companies don't think it's cool, but it kind of preemptively regulates them. So it's interesting because we don't have any AI systems that the bill is targeting, because we haven't gotten to that level yet. It's more of like a, okay, if this happens, we have something in place for it. So that took a lot of convincing Silicon Valley. There was a previous bill called SB 1047, which failed because of like people were like, oh, but like regulation is going to stifle innovation, and that was like the biggest like debate. Um, but I think there are like, you know, there needs to be at least some vague guardrails. This is SB 53 is like a weakened version of 1047. I think it's a little bit more palatable maybe to Silicon Valley's like VC firms and like startups or whatever. Um, but I think that was like a pretty good bill because we'd all been so passionate behind 1047, and we kind of gathered this like people, this like mass of people who were like, yeah, we need to make this happen again. So the fact that I did happen is pretty good. Was super happy and I found out this news earlier, but yeah, I think those are my favorite.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely insane that you've like contributed to so many of these actual laws. I mean, how can a regular everyday person um make an impact if they aren't as involved in policy or advocacy or anything? Like, how can someone who's interested in this cause help out?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think like everyone starts from somewhere. Like I also just started purely because I wanted to take the like pain that I had from all these different things I experienced on social media and put that towards like passion and power and all of that. So some ways that you can do that if you don't have like a ton of time, is that there's a lot of really great organizations doing a lot of great work. I'm a part of a coalition of young people called Design It For Us. And so we regularly put out open letters to tech CEOs. We or regularly put on like rallies and protests. And so like getting connected with these kind of organizations, I think is the first step. And in fact, the way that I kind of got involved with this advocacy work, right? Like I say, like, okay, yeah, I experienced the harms and I went to this. I guess I should maybe delve deeper into like how exactly this happened. So you mentioned the social network. I'm not sure if you watched the film The Social Dilemma, which is an incredible film that talks about everything about this, right? Like it kind of is along the premise of like if you don't pay for the product then you are the product, and it talks about, it
Oh,
has
yeah.
all these like, yeah, top like technology executives talk about, you know, what they witnessed during their time at XYZ company. So I saw this and I was like, how are we normalizing this as a society? So I guess I was just like a little sweaty high schooler who was like, okay, like I want to do something. So I searched up, I was like, you know, how do I get involved with the social dilemma? And that was like, I don't know why I thought that I'd ever get anything back. But, you know, it turns out that there was a conference being hosted by the Social Dilemma in
Mhm.
collaboration with this organization called Look Up. So then I was a panelist and talked about like my harms. And then slowly from there, I became like, and there are a few steps in between, but I became the chair of Look Up's Youth Leadership Council. And that's how I got exposed to all this.
Oh,
So it's very much like small steps that like take you all the way. So I think honestly, just being genuinely curious and being connected with the right organizations is good because back, then there weren't a lot of orgs in the space doing such collective efforts, but now there are, and they're all band together, and they're doing great things. Like, for example, SB53 designed for us, and this organization called Encode also did like a lot as well. Encode was a co-sponsor for SB53, and so we've done a lot of joint advocacy efforts with them. So I would say like that's it. It's like shameless plug, but also just genuinely the best way to get involved.
Yeah, no, that's insane. Like I yeah, even as a high school student, I would say you've made a pretty insane impact. I don't want to take up too much of your time, so I guess my last question for you is just, do you have any last thoughts for the audience of like, you know, I guess you already mentioned tips for getting involved, but you know, the concept of tech ethics, anything like that?
I would say that like tech ethics is a very discouraging place to be sometimes, because you're going up against like the big guns that have like millions and billions of dollars and have
Mhm.
like 100,000 different employees doing different things. Um, so I think like when I first got involved with ethics and safety, I felt a little discouraged. And actually in between, I was like, okay, I'm not going to work on ethics anymore. I'm going to go do consulting, or I'm going to do some like other corporate nonsense. But I would say that like honestly, when we win, it's extremely gratifying. And like it's like a feeling that, I've worked at corporate internships. And this feeling of like winning for the greater good is something that you can't replace. So I would say like, whether it's like the research that people are doing or advocacy or whatever it is, you're like bound to hit some kind of like roadblock. But I would just like encourage everyone to keep that like final goal of like what you want this technology or what you want society to look like, and keep working towards that. Um, and yeah, I guess that's basically it. Thank you for hosting me on this podcast and doing
Yeah,
the
of
work that you do. I
course.
think there needs to be more, of a spotlight in this place. So I'm glad you're doing that.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for giving us such like straightforward and digestible answers. Yeah, thank you so much for being here.